Bankrupt oil company leaves old wells and other equipment in the ground. Who should pay for the cleanup? The Supreme Court has ruled on a case involving a company called Redwater Energy Corporation. And joining me with the details is CBC's Janice McGregor. She is in Ottawa. The Supreme Court then, the top court, Janice, what did it rule?
It found that it is no longer okay to assume that just because you're declaring bankruptcy, you can walk away from your other obligations. In this case, it was a bankrupt oil company that owned some wells, many of which were no longer operable. It also had pipelines, other facilities. And what it wanted to do was sell the few properties that were still valuable. There were some wells that were still in use, and never mind the rest, never mind its responsibility to clean up and tear down equipment and so forth on the rest of the properties, focus on selling the valuable ones and pay off creditors. And this was seen as not okay. You can imagine why. The Alberta Energy Regulator wanted it to live up to the responsibilities of its license, which does require some remediation of the land on which these wells stand. There are environmental cleanup responsibilities inherent in having this license. So it went to court. And the lower courts took a look at what was in conflict here, and they found that the Federal Bankruptcy Act would suggest that what the trustee should be doing in this bankruptcy is paying off the creditors. In the sense, you owe money to financial institutions, well, then yes, you should sell off your valuable wells, pay them off, and yes, that means you won't be able to comply with the orders to remediate the property, but you know, the Federal Bankruptcy Act is paramount. We have a thing in this country where it's called the paramountcy doctrine, and it basically means that if there's a conflict between a federal law and some kind of a provincial law or regulation, usually the federal one applies. Today, the Supreme Court, however, did not see things the same way as the lower courts did. Instead, the Supreme Court, rather, now is kind of turning this around, saying, you know, this isn't really a question of debts. This isn't really a matter of something we consider only in terms of the federal bankruptcy legislation. This is also a duty to your fellow citizens. The majority decision, it was a 5-2 decision, I should say, there was a dissent. The majority decision was written by Chief Justice Richard Wagner, and he actually sort of said just flat out, bankruptcy is not a license to ignore the rules. And so going forward, in this case and in other cases, it's now more clear that a provincial energy regulator, as we had in Alberta in this case, can still enforce environmental orders and other obligations on a trustee that is going through a bankruptcy for a company.
So what does today's ruling mean then for other cases if we look down the road in the future?
Yeah, a couple of really interesting things. It was a complicated briefing, it's quite a case, but there's an interesting section that talks about this Federal Bankruptcy Act, and the Chief Justice here is actually suggesting that Parliament may want to re-examine this act in the future, because apparently this kind of conflict between the federal and the provincial kind of laws and obligations here is common in bankruptcy cases, and there is language that suggests that trustees aren't liable for not complying with provincial orders. And the Supreme Court today is sort of throwing that back at Parliament and saying, you know, you may want to clarify this. This may be something where we need to have another go at that language to emphasize it. But in the meantime, let's think about this from the perspective of landowners, from, frankly, taxpayers, from people who want to have provincial regulations about what you do with energy projects, not just in oil and gas, in mining, in possibly other situations, where they want provincial rules to still apply, regardless of whether a company goes under or not. Today's ruling is very good news for them. If it had gone the other way, it would have been possible for people to say, hey, I'm bankrupt, sorry. Can't do that. I think it must be a relief, perhaps, for people who are looking at abandoned sites and wondering who's going to pay for it. This makes it a little bit more clear.
Thanks for that, Janice. CBC's Janice McGregor in Ottawa.